have a distinct memory from my high school days, specifically from high school Spanish, where one of my friends was talking about one of our other classmates and saying something about how her Spanish was very good. In fact, she could even do the accent. This was a model of languages that I kept for a very long time, probably through college. The idea that I had was that for a given foreign language, its sounds, what's called the phonology, were basically the sounds we make in English but with an accent placed on top. And this isn't that unreasonable of a model to construct if you're a monolingual English-speaking American. After all, the majority of languages you're likely to encounter or study have phonologies that aren't too dissimilar from English. Spanish, French, and German are all fairly similar in phonology to English. But this isn't really how it works. Languages each have their own set of consistent sounds. Sometimes these sounds map quite neatly onto another language. Other times, they don't. Some languages have sounds that are hugely foreign to an English speaker's ears. Sounds that you've maybe never heard, or that you maybe didn't even know existed. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Some of my favorite sounds in human languages. Sound number 1, the rolled R. R's are tricky, as many sounds that we transcribe with an R are actually pretty different. The rolled R isn't that similar to the English R sound, and if you grew up without a rolled R in your first language, your L1, there's a good chance that you're unable to produce this sound. It took me about a year of practice while speaking Portuguese before I was able to make the sound. One of the things that I really like about the rolled R is that it can come in a lot of different forms. You can get the bold, aggressive rolled R of Mozambican Portuguese, like in the word Respeito, but you can also get a soft and gentle rolled R, like in the Icelandic word Hrapa. Both are rolled R's, but their effect is very different. Sound number 2, the voiceless L. Consonants generally come in pairs, voiced and voiceless. The only difference between the two is whether or not you use your vocal cords. Touch your throat and make the S and Z sound, S and Z. You should feel your throat buzz for Z, but not for S. The same thing happens with P and B, T and D, K and G. I would encourage you to make each one of these pairs of sounds to feel that buzzing or lack of buzzing for yourself. So most consonants in English come in these pairs of voiced and voiceless, but there are a few that are alone without a companion, like the letter L. We only have a voiced L in English. There exist some languages, though, that have both, or languages that only have the voiceless version. Instead of they have sh. Take the Icelandic word hlusta. The L sound isn't voiced, you don't have hlusta, it's voiceless, hlusta. You can also hear the sound when Icelanders speak English, as they'll often sub our voiced L for their voiceless. So an Icelander might not say cool, but instead say cool. Sound number 3, the voiceless N. Similar to our unpaired voiced L, we only have the voiced N in English, like in not or nose. The curious thing about the voiceless N, though, is that it is literally just breathing out of your nose. And this is a very uncommon sound in human languages. But it happens to be all over the place in Icelandic. For example, their word for knife is hnífur. If you listen carefully, you can hear me breathing out of my nose at the front of that word. Another great word that uses this consonant is their word for raven, which is hrap. Now, I'm definitely exaggerating a little bit with these sounds, but you definitely can hear that breathing out of the nose sound anytime an Icelander says hrap. Sound number 4, the voiced velar fricative. Okay, sorry. We've moved outside of the realm of sounds that have easy English counterparts, so I have to use the official names for these sounds. The voiced velar fricative most closely resembles the English hard G. which is a voiced velar stop. So take the word saga, a word English got directly from Icelandic. This word, which in Icelandic is just their word for story, has the pronunciation saga. It's not a hard stop, but instead a more gentle fricative. Not saga, but saga. This shows up as well in the Portuguese pronunciation of agua. There isn't a hard G, but instead the voiced velar fricative. So not agua, but agua. Sound number 5, the voiceless alveolar lateral affricate. Back in 2012, one of Iceland's many volcanoes decided to erupt. It gained notoriety for 2 reasons. The first is that its smoke and ash was so intense that it grounded a bunch of flights coming in and out of Europe. The other reason was for its quote-unquote unpronounceable name. What made its name so daunting, other than its spelling and its length, was its usage of this voiceless alveolar lateral affricate. The sound sounds like kla, and the volcano's name is Eyjafjallajökull. The sound isn't very common in human languages, but it is widespread. That is, it's not clustered in individual language families or geographic areas. In fact, my first exposure to this sound came during my Peace Corps service. The local language in the town I served in, Makua, doesn't have this sound, but the local language where I was trained, Shangana, does. For example, their verb to play is kutlanga. Sound number 6, ejectives. This one isn't so much a single sound as a class of sounds. Every consonant in English is classified as a pulmonic consonant. That is a consonant that relies on your lungs, think pulmonary system, to drive the air through your throat and mouth to generate sound. There exist 3 types of non-pulmonic consonants. There are clicks, which are very rare, and exist in languages like Hlusta. This was the language that the Wakandan language of Black Panther was modeled on. There are also implosives, which are almost as rare as clicks, and really only exist in a cluster in Africa and a cluster in Southeast Asia. I don't really know a lot about these ones. And then there are ejectives. Most of our consonants in English can be ejectified. Instead of pushing the air through your mouth with your lungs, you build up a high-pressure system in your mouth and then open your mouth to release it. For an example, to ejectify some English consonants, take T. Instead of a word like top, you'd get op. With K, instead of kit, you'd get it. With P, instead of pat, you would get at. Like all of the non-pulmonic consonants, ejectives are pretty rare, but they're found in abundance in the indigenous languages of the Americas. This includes the Klallam language, which has all sorts of ejectives. For example, their word for wall is ungen, with an ejective T. Klallam also has an ejective version of the voiceless alveolar lateral affricate, that kla sound in Eyjafjallajökull. So instead of kla, you get a. An example of this in action would be with the Klallam word for butterfly, which is apt. Before I go, I do feel the need to leave a small disclaimer. This whole episode comes from the perspective of a native English speaker. And although many of these sounds might seem strange or silly, I would encourage you to do your best to imagine them as normal sounds. 'Cause they are. They just happen to not exist in the language I'm currently conducting this podcast in. And it's not as though American English only has quote-unquote normal sounds. You know, the English R isn't super common as far as consonant sounds go, and I've mentioned in the past that the English TH sound is extremely rare. You could imagine a podcast in a different language talking about the voiced and voiceless dental fricative, that's the TH sound, and how weird it is that you press your tongue up against the top row of your teeth to make a sound. The sounds I discussed here only seem exotic and strange because they happen to not exist in English. So these are some of my favorite sounds that don't exist in English. And like many of the topics I bring up in the Daily Gaily podcast, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. You might have also noticed my huge bias here in that all of these sounds I brought you today come from languages that I just happen to have experience with. But again, these are really just a small set of the huge number of sounds that exist in human languages. Depending on how you count, there are hundreds of distinct consonant sounds that human beings make to share and express their ideas. There's so much to see and discover with linguistics and human languages. I'd encourage you to explore them whenever you get the chance.